under the most evil communist regime, Khmer Rouge, because their latest show, their latest episode, or their latest coverage revolves around the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. So let's start that. Let's start that process now. Here's a 3-minute ad break. Boom. All right.
We're still fighting the Vietnam War, and if we have to use the Khmer Rouge as a pawn in that, we'll use them.
I do it again. 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 I do it again.
Some of the chatters are saying you guys gave Nixon and Kissinger too much aura.
Well,
Brilliant, by the way.
The whole aura of that video, as was our last season's trailer, is due to Ben Clarkson, who's the animator. He's a great illustrator. He has a new graphic novel out called Justice Warriors, Vote Harder. So a lot of credit due to Ben. Also, Dan Beckner, great musician, did that Doom guitar you hear in the middle with me and the track I wrote for it. So yeah, we like putting these little trailers together because we get to work with talented people like them. So credit to them.
Yeah. No, it's fantastic. As always, you guys did it again. I'll admit I did text Noah the other day and I was like, when is the Gladio Turkey edition of the Blowback podcast series coming? Because, you know, I would love to help out in any way I can on that. And also I think is like it's a target rich environment, you know, creating the terminology that we all love and use all the time, such as deep state, where it comes from.
Sure.
Originally.
Sure.
But yeah, we'll get to the Khmer Rouge, Nixon, Kissinger, and everything else. But obviously I wanted to start the conversation, at least in the first half, by talking about what's going on in terms of American imperialism, American empire on its last fucking stand, with our most valuable, most important ally, the only moral country in the world, the only democracy in the world with the most moral military, Israel. As we're having this conversation, Israel obviously has expanded its conflict to Lebanon beyond what it was already doing in this supposed tit-for-tat de-escalation through escalation method that they were applying, where they were responsible for 80% of the fucking munitions being deployed in the the Lebanese Israeli border skirmishes that were taking place. They obviously did an act of terror that even the likes of Leon Panetta considered to be an act of terror. And I feel like it's like Osama bin Laden being like, that's terror, dog. You know what I mean? It's like, like you are the guy, right? Like he knows what terror is, right? If he's saying it's terror, I'm going to go along with what he's saying. Or maybe he's woke. I don't know. And anti-Semitic. Who knows? So after that and the broad positive reception from Western media and Western officials in general, Israel was like, oh, hell yeah, let's keep doing what we're doing. It doesn't seem like anyone's telling us don't do it. And now they are resorting to carpet bombing southern Lebanon and doing the exact same, Hamas, anti-Hamas propaganda that they applied. But this time they just changed what comes after the from Hamas to Hezbollah in Lebanon. I wanted to hear your guys' analysis on that as the foremost experts on American imperialism. I know you had a conversation with the Chapo boys on it as well. It's okay if you repeat some of those talking points. It's all good. But how are you guys enjoying the show with Anthony Blinken defending Israel unconditionally?
Hey, how could it possibly be going better? Is what I ask myself every day. No, I mean, I think that the only thing that you left out is that, it now seems that the headlines in Reuters and the Associated Press are indications are that Israel is escalating its air attacks into a ground invasion. They're calling up reserve battalions. It still may not happen. It still might. It can go either way still, but it's not trending in a good direction. At least in the sense that it is just escalating. But Israel has never really successfully invaded Lebanon without getting a bloody nose. So we'll see what happens there.
Yeah, 2006 was the last time, right? And that did not. That was a huge. I mean, it was humiliating.
Oh, that
And
was
you have to
big,
imagine.
big bad.
You have to imagine that they're as unrestrained as they appear right now. They're going to have a much harder time going up against Hezbollah than they have against Hamas and the piece of territory that they have so much control over. This would be a different story, I think. Now, whether or not they are unhinged enough at this point to consider that, I defer to you guys.
Yeah,
Looking at what Hasan's putting up on the screen.
Oh yeah, no, I was just showcasing the words Western media use to avoid saying ground invasion, use of ground troops, ground offensive, ground maneuver.
I will say I think ground offensive is pretty fine. I think that is more or less what an invasion like it's offensive. It's not mincing there. I think the FT gets a pass from me on that one, but the rest of them
FT's
can go
done
to
pretty
hell.
good coverage on this stuff. I think from early October in general, much better than Wall Street Journal, which is in the tank and has routinely spread misinformation. As a matter of fact, misinformation that, like, if I recall correctly, the American State Department had to come out and clarify in a brief act of unity from both the U.S. State Department, the Israeli government, the Israeli intelligence services, and even Iran. If you remember when they were like, they all had to be like, yeah, we didn't know October 7 was happening. Like, everybody had to be like, yeah, Iran did not play a role in October 7 beyond like regular logistical support and training to like militants.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there is now, I think, a quality of I guess, like, the media at this stage of it is kind of it's sort of hard, I think, to communicate like why stuff is going on without just sort of like I've not read a story yet in a mainstream paper that doesn't like really kind of foreground that like Israel is choosing to escalate. Like, the facts of this situation are a lot harder to propagandize around, I think, than like the post October 7th stuff was. Like, rallying around the flag in this situation is like much more tortured and much less effective when Israel's going to war with like a somewhat neutral country, a neutral country, true, I mean, but is now like, yeah, is somehow thinks it can have that front and the other one. It all doesn't really add up to me, truthfully, as a coherent set of operations.
Yeah. So the question I have, I guess, that many people also have, and I want to hear a different perspective on this, is like, what the fuck is Israel thinking? Because, as you also correctly pointed out, they've had an incredibly hard time dealing with an ascetic resistance force that is basically in captured territory, that is under permanent Israeli mass surveillance and occupation in Gaza. They can't deal with like 17 to like 20-year-olds wearing Adidas tracksuits, running up to their fucking $30 million Merkava tanks and lobbing grenades directly into it. How the fuck are they expected to deal with an enemy with a standing military that is combat trained, that is far better equipped, that is in an entirely sovereign state, that has geared up its defenses against this potential Israeli invasion since the last two times that they successfully were able to withstand Israeli invasion?
Noah has a lot more insight into the nitty gritty. I think we talked about this on Chapo the other day a bit.
Are you just saying that because I'm Jewish, right?
Yeah, that's what I was insinuating.
Okay, I just wanted to be clear.
Let me just
wanted to be on the
get
level
the tropes
here.
out of the way. No, I mean, I follow this stuff, but we sort of had a little back and forth the other day wondering about this very question. I mean, I was sort of pointing out for my part that I think there's an obvious problem at this point with saying that Israel is doing all of this as an obedient client state of the U.S. And only that. I don't think that the U.S. Has a particular interest, as we're seeing from every new hapless cable or dispatch that the State Department puts out saying, we don't think it would be particularly constructive for them to go into Lebanon. I don't think that's kayfabe. I think the U.S. is essentially handcuffed at this moment to a rogue state that it has shrinking influence with and has had shrinking influence with over the years as a so-called client-patron dynamic. Israel is operating unlike the empire, which wants goods to flow and commodities to ultimately go back and forth all over the world, which is why the Houthis piss us off so much because they've been blocking some of that. Israel has a totally different logic, I think, at this point, which is that of a lunatic state in which, as you put it, Noah, the other day, the inmates are kind of taking over the asylum, and the colder logic of past years, which isn't to justify any of Israel's policies, it was still a relatively cold and considered logic of how to occupy and exploit and ultimately probably starve out this place, the occupied territories. You had those Shin Bet guys, the sort of old guard that would say in the documentary, like the Gatekeepers, where they talk to a bunch of Shin Bet chiefs or former Shin Bet chiefs that say, "Yeah, we're basically fascists now. That's how it is. We'll see how that works out." I think now, as Noah can obviously speak to, who's followed the kind of, he's got more of these stories that are in the news day in and day out. It seems like now this is an ethno state that has fully gone out of control and really has no choice in its own logic but to escalate, but to throw the war further on, and to like other states that had a attack dog approach toward their idea of greater Germany or greater Serbia and now greater Israel, they have no choice but to expand. So that's to just outline a little bit the difference between what I can detect in Israel's calculus and the calculus of its benefactor, the United States. I don't know. What do you think, Noah? I mean, we talked about this a couple days ago.
Yeah, I mean, the only other thing I would really add to that, because I think you kind of hit all the major points. The only thing I would add is that there is something in, like a lot of what Israel and the Israeli leadership is doing is because of strong political incentives that are domestic in Israel. Much in the same way that when you were like, why did the American military or the American political leadership make such a puzzling decision in Iraq or Afghanistan at these various points? It's often because they're driven by domestic political considerations, and Israel is no different. And in this case, the Netanyahu government, since October 7th, they had a steep fall in popularity, but then they've only gradually gotten more popular since. And the way in which that kind of escalation has sort of nourished them, it's kind of bailed them out of dealing with the problems that people were initially, at first, blushed on October 7th, more aware of than at any point since. Because now, what like the war with Hezbollah kind of staves off is what in a group of, so the Israeli central bank, I forget what it's called, it may just be called that. An economist there recently published a report stating that, like, look, if you sort of buy the general line that they're going to try to wind down the general level of conflict over the next year, during that time or at the end of it, Israel is going to have to engage in a program of radical austerity, or there is going to be a financial crisis. In fact, the financial crisis may be unavoidable without some sort of massive stabilization. I think that, like, truthfully, I do think that there is the political appetite in the U.S. government to help bail out Israel down the line. However, like, when we are not, like, that's a political problem that these guys don't want to get to. And it satisfies, as sort of Brendan laid out, like what I would sort of think of are like the bigger ideological priors that they have that kind of soup them up and get them excited and sort of legitimate their unbelievably stupid and short-sighted decision to, escalate now possibly to the point of a ground invasion with Lebanon, something that, again, historically does not go well for Israel. And it's not because, like, they didn't hit, like, up, down, down, square, circle, triangle quick enough. It's like, it's not a battle, it's not a fight that favors them. Brennan, you're a little blurry.
Oh,
Yeah, I'm trying to come back. Here we go.
There he is. Beautiful face.
yeah. I think I was listening to the New York Times Daily Report from that one, like Israeli surveillance reporter, like the Israeli national security reporter that they had on the Daily, that talked about like the increasing popularity that like the ultra nationalist far right elements within Israeli society have had over the past like 30 years. It was definitely a little bit of it was definitely a little bit of like, oh no, it's just like these guys are basically now running the country, and there is truth to that. The inmates are running the asylum, and I do routinely think about like the gravest threat to the Zionist operation being that all the academics and all the artists that make the shittiest EDM you've ever heard of inevitably leaving Israel because they just no longer consider Israel to be a truly secure nation. Like the veil of security has was obviously damaged greatly in October 7. Israel retaliated in incredibly violent ways by conducting its genocidal affairs. But beyond that, ever since then, the Iron Dome has failed time and time again, including with Houthi loitering munitions and also a hypersonic missile coming directly from Ansar Allah. These are this constitutes a genuine threat to like normal Israeli society, where they can no longer operate under the veneer of like, we are a Western nation where nothing bad will happen to you, and we can be as violent as we want to everyone without any sort of repercussions to normal Israeli society. Like, you could still go to the beach in Tel Aviv and party as we are conducting our genocide, mere miles away. And I think that constitutes a grave threat because it will inevitably turn Israel into a nation that is entirely comprised of messianic, inbred, ultra-Orthodox psychopaths with a nuclear arsenal, and further push them away as a pariah state. Obviously, that is terrifying for the future of the world, right? But it's also terrifying for the Zionist project in general. And I think that's why a lot of these like Shin Bet guys regularly try to like speak out against that, because they also want the maintenance of the apartheid to continue to a certain degree that is manageable in a way that does not disrupt the regular order of business. And while, they have recognized that they're slowly losing their grip on power, the thing that comes to mind, obviously, like the former Shin Bet official that told Benjamin Netanyahu, if you consistently, if you continue these attacks on the West Bank, like, this is going to become an unmanageable situation. An October 7 style attack might happen. This was way before October 7. And Benjamin Netanyahu's retaliation to that was, you're woke. You've been captured by woke interests. And that's what happens when you let a guy from Philadelphia be your fucking leader. But big L on that one for Israel.
Well, we talked about this the other day too. With regard to America, there's a thesis from back in the day called the Yankee versus the Cowboy. And I think you could apply that analysis to Israel as much as anywhere else, including America, where you have divides in the ruling class. There are those Israelis in power who we were just describing, who want to maintain their hegemony in the area. Maybe someday they hope Israel could take over more of the land officially, but for now it's okay to maintain it. Similar to the American, during the Cold War and beyond, the American Eastern establishment who thought, let's keep Europe stable, let's run NATO, let's do containment, and we'll get there. Versus the frontier types, the Yahoos, the cowboys, who in the American example would be, your pro-Vietnam China lobby types who wanted to take the Cold War into Asia, where they thought it was really going to cook and pop off, not worry about Europe, who they viewed as a bunch of, snobbish leeches of America. And in Israel, the example would be exactly the crowd we've been talking about, the so-called inmates taking over the asylum who want the frontier to keep going, the manifest destiny to keep going, not in a 50-year period, not in a 100-year period, but right now, today and tomorrow. And that's who, as Noah was pointing out, that's who's taking over. And that's not necessarily a good thing for their fellow Zionists because it's short-sighted, it's unstrategic, and while it's horribly violent and a terrible thing for everyone else as well, it's ultimately kind of a death drive and suicidal. So the question will be if they, exhaust themselves before they take everyone else out with them. I mean, you got to imagine, not to get too grim, but you've got to imagine the U.S., at some points are saying, let's say we do start to cut them off, are they going to start talking about tactical nukes or this or that? Or are they crazy enough to make that threat and then actually press the button? That's going to keep people up in the State Department in a way that is a bit of a hostage situation of its own. So I think that is the kind of dichotomy that we're seeing right now as far as the different groups trying to direct Israel's destiny at the expense of everyone else.
Yeah. Also, to further prove the point that you're making, we saw this divergence within the State Department with those who want to maintain American hegemonic power status early on, with calls for restraint towards Israel because they knew what Israel was going to do, against those who were unconditional and undying Zionists themselves who truly believe that like Israel must not be restrained and they should actually blow off a little bit of steam, or even, like you said, manifest destiny in the way that they wanted to. And that's why you saw like State Department officials resign. And that's why you are now getting reports from ProPublica about even fucking U.S. aid and other State Department agencies creating memos all the way back, I believe, in April, and sending it to Anthony Blinken to be like, hey, Israel is actually in direct contravention with American laws, the Leahy law to be exact.
No. We should be fair here. We should be really fair, because similar memos were drafted for when the State Department approved the arming of Saudi Arabia in their campaign against the Houthis.
Yes.
So, Hasan, Brendan, we cannot pick on the only Jewish state to get arms in contravention of war crimes statutes and laws.
Yes, and
because that would be wrong.
I was, of course, very much in support of the Saudi kingdom continuously.
I'm watching your tropes. Yeah. I'm watching your tropes.
Thank you for keeping me honest. Yes,
absolutely, man. It's fucking crazy out here.
Okay, I'll do one.
You never know, like Jonathan Greenblatt, just like
I'll do one back at you. It seems quite Islamophobic that you are coming after the Muslim nation of Saudi Arabia. That's where Mecca is, okay? And Medina. You understand?
And Medina, shit.
Not just Mecca, but Medina as well. And you coming after the Muslim nation is quite Islamophobic.
Can someone take a pot shot at Ireland or something so I can get in here and have an attended moment?
Oh, now the potato farmer speaks up. Oh boy.
Well, there you go. The Irish phobia is alive and well, folks. It's completely permissible. You could just say that and get away with it. It's fucked up.
It is.
But okay, all jokes aside.
One thing I do want to add on the point of like the sort of like how Israel's getting more radical and like what is its interest or whatever. A lot of it is that like Israel is already like it has been on sort of like years of decline in the way that like a lot of the West has broadly. Income inequality has widened. The economic it's basically like there's like Poland is doing good, I guess, but like pretty much everyone else has been doing pretty bad. Although America's recovered.
World.
Yeah, right. Seriously, man. Like for next thing you know, we're going to be asking them to screw in our light bulbs. In any event, like this. So Israel is not like immune from like this secular change, like bad change in condition in the financial and economic health of the country, and it's also not really like it's quite clearly losing its edge as like an offensive military power. They can do a lot of this, they can blow up Hania, they can do the pager attack. They clearly are willing to do these things as well. But like, there is like it's not just crazies pulling the trigger on those things.
Says
like,
that it has.
I think that the crazies are gaining currency because they're being led in from the center in a sense. I mean, like, look, like the emergency powers essentially that Hitler had ready made for him when he assumed power were there because Gruning, had them, more or less had them as part of like like twilight of the Weimar government. I don't again like I don't want to be in the habit of making like 1-to-1 history of Nazi Germany, history of Israel comparisons, but like
Well,
that
they
one
make it
seems to
hard
me to
not
be
to. I mean,
as
so-
among many other points of comparison.
yeah.
Well,
That's why it's
well,
always
the
funny
other.
when they. All right, go ahead, Brendan. Sorry.
I was just gonna say. I mean, that's another way that you can look at like a dichotomy is that Israel has always done shenanigans like this, blowing up a bunch of people, assassinations of civilians. They've done that in the past. I mean, they spy on Americans, and the liberty and all of that. There's a long history of all this, but they've always been, the Forrest Gumps that get to go on TV and like, be mascots essentially on talk shows and stuff like that. But also videos from the battlefield, if you want to call it that, in which the soldiers are doing war crimes in plain view. I mean, that is not
Well, I'll actually add to
clean image.
I'll add to that and then kick it to Hasan because I think there's like a question we can put to him there on that, which is that like, because I agree with Brendan, like, Abba Eban, who was sort of like the OG effective Anglo like language Israel diplomat of my parents' generation, who was very charming, had very very good for television and so on. He's like Elon Levy, pales in comparison to somebody like him and so on. That is like a thing of the past. I think now that the reason that they don't give a shit about that sort of like deluge of imagery and the sort of like how horrible their advocates are now, the sort of Loomer-ification of like all of like the Zionists or whatever. I think that it's because it's it follows like it fits like broad patterns of political polarization, along gender, along generational lines, especially class, etc. Like it's becoming it's mapping onto broadly speaking like the left-right dichotomy. Not everything falls like not all parts of it, but it does seem to me like it conforms to that like pretty epically. That said, Hasan, like it does seem though that like there are a bunch of influencers or people like oh yeah, like that guy Ethan Klein, like he shared a screenshot of a screenshot of a screenshot of something I said, which I love when that happens. And like, but like he's like somebody who it's like okay, clearly he has like an audience of like people on the internet or whatever, but he's also like a very big pro-Israel moron. And like clearly like there is like some like novel development in like how certain people are like effective pro-Israel advocates now representing that viewpoint from like a younger generation, but like who are like achieving something even if they don't have the finesse of like earlier folks or whatever.
I don't think Ethan Klein's audience is as even remotely seemingly pro-Israel as he is. That's my assessment, which is why he's constantly duking it out with his own audience or with regular frequency on this issue. But as far as like what has changed, I think a couple things. Like obviously a pivotal point was 2021 when a lot of the NGOs that I normally am somewhat critical of openly declared Israel to be an apartheid, which took away like a massive cynical deployment of anti-Semitism whenever you brought this thing up, right? Because you could be like, well, these are institutions that like are formative in the rule-based international order, and they are all also correctly calling Israel an apartheid regime. And I think ever since then, with also social media and the fact that people can like actually humanize Palestinians and directly hear from them, the dynamic has changed quite a bit because of that democratization of information spreading and not being completely captive to mainstream outlets that will repeat the State Department line unconditionally and vociferously. A lot of people have been able to make up their own minds about what they see as like truly a bloody and barbaric affair. I think that is also that plays a major role. But beyond that, I think that the complacency that Israel has with many years of like complete like unconditional support that Israel gets from mainstream media has, I think, it caused them to miss a step a little bit. Like you're now seeing operations being launched online. You every now and then you'll see like a pro trans black former vet Christian come out and be like, y'all not gonna do this right now with the what was it? I think Krang T. Nelson had the tweet. I gotta fucking pull it up real quick to show you. But it was like it was such a ridiculous and so obviously like a shitty ass like this shit makes like Russian attempts look brilliant in comparison. Here, this is the one I'm
or
thinking
these
of.
like
Watermelon
oh
ISIS
yeah
on
watermelon
their
ISIS
anti-blackness, Jewish hating bullshit again. Fuck these terrorists wannabes. Nail emoji, nail emoji, nail emoji, and it's just like when you look at the account, it's like Black Trans Lives at Truly Be Truly Free, Trans Pride Flag, Black Trans Pride Worldwide. Jesus is the way and the truth. Veteran, I don't even know what the APRN.
Yeah, what's
MSN
APR? Is that a nurse thing? Hold
know.
on? What does your chat say? What's APRN MSN mean?
I have no idea. Veteran, to earn respect, you must learn respect. Joined May 2024. It's like come on. And it's
also,
like
wait,
AI.
hold on. Go to the profile picture. Go to the that's
Yeah.
it's
AI.
It's AI. Look, it's filled in. It looks like it's incompletely filled in.
Yeah, look at the Israeli flag shirt that she's wearing.
Also, look at how like it's like the background. It looks like you're like drunk in Tunis. It looks like.
Yeah. So I mean, this right here. Like, if this is your attempt of causing some kind of instability amongst the normal groups that are like advocates for Palestinian emancipation, like this is a horrifyingly bad job. Like you are not carrying out a good operation here at all, right? And there's many such examples of this. Like, and I think it comes from a place of complacency. In many respects, I think like Israel saw what happened to apartheid South Africa and learned all the lessons of what not to do, and greatly increased its operations in ensuring that America always maintain a positive attitude towards Israel. But I think they got a little too comfortable in that and didn't recognize that like in the new age of information with the internet, you can't really get away with all the bloodlust, no matter how hard, how hard you try.
I agree with that, and I'd also add that like something else that like definitely changed was there is like a sort of like downward linear level of like appreciation and identity that like the average like or the median American has with the state of Israel. And you could sort of think of it as like the apex was when Paul Newman starred in the movie Exodus in like the 1950s or 60s. And then, but ever since then, it's been sort of like progressively downhill as people see like Israel's true nature revealed time and time and time again. And it's obviously uneven, but and like I think there may have actually been a pro-Israel peak in the 1980s, but like broadly speaking, when we look at like now the history like through the 2020s, we see that it's this big downhill thing. And there is like you can't outrun that. Like it's coming. It was a change bound up in generations, and that was always going to make this kind of level of advocacy really difficult the next time. In fact, by the way, like Israel's committed an unprecedented slaughter, and they've committed this unprecedented slaughter at a time when like everybody has a fucking camera attached to themselves. Like there is just like this is what it means to be pro-Israel in 2024, and there was no amount of spin or nothing that like in the discourse pursuant to Israeli actions that is really could be that different, because the actions are now like it's the whole landscape's different. It's all done changed.
I'll give you a domestic example for those in the audience to understand a little bit better. I often talk about the Republican Party refusing to fucking run a normal campaign and their complete inability to do so, right? they have hugboxed themselves into believing that like everybody cares about only trans people, and they always want to think about like children's genitals, right? And that kind of trans panic and crime panic narratives actually cost them the midterm election successes that they were supposed to get under a Biden administration where Americans were experiencing negative real wage growth. Like at that time, it should have been the Republican Party wiping the fucking table. But they got so comfortable and so insane that they put up like Doug Mastriano, for example, like a QAnon guy, as the governor of fucking Pennsylvania. They brought forward Herschel Walker. And a lot of people single out Donald Trump, but I think this is the entire Republican Party so hyper-focused on culture war narratives that they end up coming across as truly repulsive to like normal people that aren't as invested in those narratives. And I think a similar thing could be said about Israel in the sense that like they legitimately think everybody thinks in the way that they do, all the way from the most quote unquote woke liberal Zionist down to the settler in Hebron spitting on the fucking nuns. Israeli society has been hugboxed and echo chambered into thinking that like when they say, oh, we are going to kill all their children, and when like an American hits the translate from Hebrew button, they're going to look at that and go, yeah, no, they're doing the right thing. I'm on board. I'm invested. I'm just as invested in this genocidal project as you are. They don't. Mm-hmm. They think it's weird. There's also like obviously resilient underlying anti-Semitism at play here as well, both from the ultra-nationalist and pro-Israel contingency, like the evangelical Christians, who will be like, Israel must be defended because they're God's chosen sons, and also, while simultaneously in the same breath, repeat things like they have horns and tails and are the magic money people, down to...
Well, it's a classic case of like how like if there are like all these like correct Jews who are like these perfected little humans who live over there, then like, well, we've got all these surplus, Jews who, as Trump said, are going to be the reason he loses the election. There's nothing that makes me feel more secure than like a really, really, really like pro-Israel guy in Kentucky who didn't meet a Jewish person until he was 28.
Yeah. But beyond that anti-Semitism, there's like a underlying, like Felix brought up this point when he was on the broadcast, and I completely agree with him. Like, let's say you fucking grew up in like Omaha, Nebraska. You've never met a Jewish person ever, but you have consistently heard the narrative in normal conversations, right? Because a lot of people do like secretly believe this shit where they're like, there are a lot of wealthy Jews in media and in positions of power, and there's not a lot of Jews in general. Like when you have that underlying attitude and then you see what's going on, okay, and then you see like the entirety of Congress get up and deliver a standing ovation to Benjamin Netanyahu as he's like talking about how there are college campus terrorists out there that are backed by Hamas. Like, what are you supposed to think? You know what I mean? Like, this is how anti-Semitism festers and grows, like real anti-Semitism, not ADL shit that I'm talking about. Like
the old I mean, as of 10 or 15 years ago, I remember there was the Mearsheimer Waltz book, The Lobby, right? The Israel Lobby.
Yeah, that was 18 years ago.
Yeah. That was controversial. It was, that's what got you really in trouble, back then, was to insinuate that this was a well-organized political movement within the United States working on behalf of a country that is literally in its political committee's name. But if you start, and of course people can go overboard with that, and what they really mean is the secret lizard cabal or whatever, and we all know what we think of that. But to deny a clinical treatment that you would give the China lobby, the Cuba lobby, any other one of these organized political movements for the benefit of another country within America to make sure it continues to get support, and you try to drum that out of the like polite discourse or reasonable discourse, you try to completely bury that.
Yeah.
And then Netanyahu shows up and gets nonstop applause, and Israel gets blank checks, do whatever it wants. As you said, Hasan, people are going to actually resort to actual anti-Semitic theories and the galaxy of websites that are dealing in crackpot nonsense, instead of looking at perhaps unpleasant but nasty realities in the American-Israeli relationship that are worth discussing and that can be looked at and written about and debated. And I remember it was just like you could get in real trouble back then if you even talked about AIPAC as a factor at all. I was young,
Ilhan
but
Omar.
you could see it. And
Omar got yelled at by
exactly.
the Democratic Party as well as like the entire media apparatus for saying it's all about the Benjamins, baby. And they were like, what do you mean, Benjamin? It's a Jewish name or whatever the fuck they were saying at the time. Or they're saying, oh, you mean money Jews are puppeteering the American government? It's like, no, she's talking about fucking AIPAC. Like, it's very obvious she's talking about lobbying. Okay.
Which gives the money not because it has any effect, but because they just love politicians.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just so, it's so stupid to like not realize that one, marrying Israel's actions to Judaism as a defensive posture is unironically going to cause people to look at that and go, well, I have no critical thinking skills, but these guys are saying they're doing it for Judaism. And those who are defending the guys that are saying they're doing it for Judaism are also saying you're anti-Semitic. So I guess this is something that Jews want universally. And that's why, like, you brought up the Trump anti-Semitism conference earlier. I thought it was very instructive on both what the media chose to cover from that conference and what they chose to omit. Donald Trump very clearly in that conference said, I gave you Golan Heights. You didn't even ask for it, and I gave it to you because you gave me money. And he named Sheldon and Miriam Adelson in that conference. And then he also spoke about, like, this idea that, like, again, this false notion that like all Jews as a monolithic force only care about Israel, because he kept repeating that. He was like, I gave you all the shit that you want. What more do you want from me? Why the fuck aren't you voting for me? What's wrong with you? That was the main through line there. And if you are on a Monday defending the notion that all Jews care about Israel, you're not going to be able to cover that with the adequate tools necessary to be like, no, that's anti-Semitic. It's not just anti-Semitic when a Nazi says it. It's anti-Semitic when those who are pro-Israel are saying that as well, even if they're cynically using it as a defensive shield.
Now with the whole, I haven't followed it closely, but the slander from CNN, Dana Bash, and Jake Tapper, I think much like the Israeli, charm offensive is not what it used to be. Americans who probably, like American media figures, who probably would have gotten away with something like this not so long ago, it seems like now there is a genuine pushback that makes it to their desk where they have to weasel out of it, as I believe Bash did yesterday. She didn't issue a correction, which is the word she should have used, but she issued a clarification, I think she said, about Rashida Tlaib and her remarks that they tried to paint as anti-Semitic. And again, it wasn't so long ago that would have been the end of it, but people just aren't buying that anymore, and that's a big problem, obviously.
It also, that one was like a little bit of like a sort of like perfect storm of like they made up a lie. The guy who they made up the smear about Tlaib. The guy who was the interviewer who was supposedly a part of it like declaimed it immediately, and they still ran with it. Like that one was like a full, like that was to me a sort of illustration of like how they have to bend over backwards to give it to their natural affinities in ways that they didn't, it used to be a little bit more subtle, or it was, I mean now even they I'm kind of surprised at the very least that like they even got an apology out of it, even from Jonathan Greenblatt. But I guess that one really was that egregious. One other thing that also strikes me with this stuff is that the like real anti-Semitism, to me, like the idea of like people who like want to like like who dislike Jews and dislike what they perceive to be Jewish influence and stuff. Like it does sort of strike me that there is like a now like the JD Vance stuff has also felt like a certain degree like, oh, like, well, those people now do have like a home as part of like the latent Republican Party. And so as things deteriorate in the Middle East, like now those people have a platform and a soapbox so much to stand that they didn't before. You know, perfectly conveniently timed for like the single most anti-Semitic thing that's ever about to happen.
Yeah.
Outside of the Holocaust.
I guess the final question before we move on to the Khmer Rouge and your latest series is the question that I hear all the time and I give answers to all the time, which is like, why is America so committed to Israel? Sorry. Like, why is America so committed to Israel? What are your opinions on it?
This is sort of what kicked off our discussion the other day with on Chapo is you know, you probably discussed this on your show many times. I mean, you have a period of history where America really wasn't did not have this special relationship at all. I don't know if you would disagree, Noah, but I mean, we really cemented with Kissinger and Nixon, funnily enough, our most anti-Semitic president on record, at least.
Oh yeah,
was the
he's
guy
like Israel's basically fate kind of hangs in the balance in the Yom Kippur War, and it really rides on whether or not whether or not America's going to rearm Israel. And Kissinger says, "Do it," and they do it, and and forever after, we were bound
It was a
together.
Cold War. It was a Cold War. It was like many, if not all, factors of American foreign policy at that moment. It was a Cold War maneuver, given that the Arab states were all predisposed to either live with or be friendly with the Soviet bloc. But at any rate, in 2024, my little case that I laid out with Chapo guys was that the relationship is disintegrating. Whether it'll completely fall apart, I don't know. It's of course hard to imagine that given what we've all people of our age have grown up with. But it is disintegrating for reasons we've discussed on here today. However, America's power is waning. CENTCOM is in the Middle East. It's an incredibly important part of the big chain of military bases and the apparatus that more than economics or political power at this point is what keeps our machine humming as an empire. And we have to ironically get more and more humiliated by this ally in order to tell ourselves that it's good that we even still have an ally there in the first place, because everywhere else you look, it's slipping away. And China's doing a lot more by way of business and persuasion and outwheeling and dealing the capitalist point men in the world. So I think that the reason at this current moment why we're still so attached at the hip is actually one of desperation and ultimate confusion and incoherence, given that it's a moment of deterioration between what used to be America's lock on the Middle East and what is coming next, which is a question mark for us.
I agree with Brendan a lot on that. That like it is sort of the incoherence, unpredictable. Like this is not a moment in which like an existing order is reasserting itself with might and vigor and revealing to us like the ley lines of the global power sphere or whatever. It's far from that. In fact, like we're seeing things kind of as to use Brendan's word, disintegrate. We're seeing things fall apart. And it's not that there is like in this bipolar world like somebody else trying to immediately fill the void. It's that things are resisting being a part of like this neat sphere of influence that we've carved out for ourselves. And it's not like which is not to say that like Gaza is aflame because they're part of the like JD Pon Chinese anti-US order or something like that, but that like all of this are these are different symptoms in their own way of like this same kind of, again, like decline, rot, the ability to unproductively manage these really core relationships that underpin the American power system around the world.
Yeah, it's no defense of Israel. Sorry, it's no defense of American statecraft or America in general to say that I don't think they share the goals that Israel that Israel has in Gaza. I think it's just a fact of the matter that they are, for their own reasons, more opposed toward rocking the boat with this fragile yet still existent allyship, however increasingly unstrategic it is, than the alternative. And that they would probably prefer this shit were over because there's an election in a month and a half, but that
Yeah.
it's not something they're willing to risk in the long term because, as I said earlier, things are cracking up, and they need to take their friends, however duplicitous, take their friends where they can find them for now.
Yeah, I think they can also trust Israel, I guess, given, I mean, in spite of all of the like counter espionage that Israel's committed against America, or even like the USS Liberty incident, like you mentioned, they still have this attitude where they feel like they can trust Israel more than they can with even like Saudi Arabia, which at times will go against America's interest with OPEC plus. They
Sure.
can Israel seemingly, from their calculation, I talked about this earlier today, is like more stable as a reliable ally than even a country like Egypt, which is a client state, but a client state that still has an active, majority, almost entirely Muslim population that can sometimes overthrow their puppet leadership, the American puppet leadership. And that's like a risk that they're not willing to take, in the same way that they can have a guy who may or may not have been, I mean, definitely was Mossad, but may or may not have also been a CIA asset at a certain point, be the fucking prime minister. Like there's a level of assurance that you have with Israel at the end of the day being a willing party to American hegemonic power in the region. Because at the end of the day, what the fuck are they going to do? Are they going to go get weapons from China and Russia? Like, would that be able to carry them across any fucking finish line? Of course not.
No, we brought that up the other day too, and Felix pointed out Russia can't even take Kyiv. It's not going to be able to fill the role of America. But I do think that 50 years from now, things could look very different in Israel. You could imagine a scenario where they go full pariah and take what they can get from everybody rather than just have this uniquely profitable relationship with America, depending on the breaks. But for now, I think everyone, however suspicious they are of each other, however resentful they are of each other, they still want to preserve an antiquated, ultimately Cold War alliance that has fallen out of kind of historical meaning at this point in time.
Yeah, especially when considering like the complicated relationship that Israel has with Russia in general as well. I mean, there are a shit ton of Russian nationals that are now Israeli, some of which aren't even Jewish, but they're just Israeli. And that is the reason why, the pro-Israel, pro-Russia contingency is not exclusive to the MAGA Republicans that got duped by like a Telegram.
And also to your point about like Israel and Russia's relationship, Israel has a relationship with Ukraine as well, and there's lots of Ukrainian nationals in Israel, including, rumor has it, members of Zelensky's family. Like, I think that the idea is that Israel, in the same way that like Istanbul is considered sort of neutral ground for the wealthy and the bourgeois of both sides of like the Saudi Iran like divide for the 2010s. It's the one place in the region where you can catch a flight to like pretty much any city. I think that you could make the mic's coming in a bit hot. I think I'm sorry, I forgot what the point of comparison was.
You were talking about Istanbul, and you activated my fight or flight, and
by bringing up Turkey?
By bringing up Turkey, Turkish President Erdogan, I don't approach Hamas as a terrorist organization. Turkish President Erdogan also gave a UN speech where he compared Benjamin Netanyahu to Adolf Hitler and demanded the Western powers take action as they did during World War II yesterday. Oh my woke king Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Mr. NATO.
I mean, he plays the watermelon seller plays every side of it.
Yeah,
he's play
both sides and you come out on top. Yeah, he's I mean, he has a lot of internal pressure, but this is what happens when you have allegiances with majority Muslim nations. That is like a perfect demonstration, right? You have a lot of internal pressure from your constituents that are like looking at the situation and going, what the fuck are you saying? I covered this extensively in the beginning. Early October, Recep Tayyip Erdogan was somewhat pro-Israel. As a matter of fact, a lot of the ultra-nationalist, anti-Erdogan constituencies in Turkey were also pro-Israel because of their overwhelming hatred for the Syrian refugees that now live in Israel, the ultra-nationalists, I mean. But they changed their attitude.
Strategic alliance with the Israelis, even though you fucking hate their guts, is like a Middle Eastern pastime.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, we train in Turkey Israeli fighter pilots, so that has never changed. So, and also the Turkish government is obviously in allegiance with Azerbaijan, which got most of their weapons from Israel. When they were conducting their ethnic displacement campaign in Karabakh. And beyond that, obviously, Israeli energy flows from Azerbaijan through Turkish pipelines directly into Israel, which comprises, I think, like 40% of their entire energy grid.
Israel licenses weapons and works with everybody from Vietnam to China, you know, two countries that also have a rivalry, by the way. Like, I think that one of the things that like globalization and really like we're talking about this sort of like historical period beginning in like 1980 or so. So for like the last 45 years, more or less, you have had a period by which everything got like more interconnected. There's still conflict, yes, but like the economic ties that bind a lot of these countries have made open conflict that much harder. And people who could be isolated and removed from it and picked off by sanctions regimes like Saddam Hussein, you know, or obviously attempts on Cuba and North Korea, you know, they'll try that. But in general, like it is a very difficult thing to do. And that's, you know, it's a testament to Israel's unique the unique crazy like, you know, death cult like mania that they're gripped by at this moment. That they're kind of, you know, like they're speed running the demolition of all that. They're removing all of the complexity that has protected them for the last 44 years on top of the strategic assurances given by the US. And they're just dynamiting it with, you know, like this, you know, like really radically, you know, crazy, like even by their standards, you know, like the most violence that they have dealt probably.
Feel like there is another counterbalance out there, another superpower out there that they can lean on, like China, the more they will take action against American dominance of this sort. And I think that there are plenty who see this in the State Department. And that is probably the reason why, not because they give a shit about Palestinians. Like the guy who quit the State Department early on was the one who was in charge of like signing off on weapons transfers. Like that person has been directly responsible for the death and destruction of so many Muslim children. Okay. Yeah. I don't think he gives a fuck. I don't think it's like his appetite for dead Iraqi children and dead Muslim children, dead Arab children was you know, seethed enough that he was like, okay, enough is enough. We got to stop. I think it was more so in the interest of self-preservation that he was openly declaring America's you know, suicide pact with Israel to be problematic.
Not unlike why in the Vietnam War you had people who supported it for a while, who thought it was strategic for a while, but in the, you know, mostly Eastern establishment, pro-NATO, pro-Europe type crowd, you had a flight from that war, the support of that war, because they eventually just thought it's not worth it. And we're now suffering in the places that matter because of it. And that's again back to the Yankee cowboy dichotomy is, you know, the management of the status quo is ultimately to them. And this guy that resigned as, you know, weapons czar or whatever he was, the status management of a good status quo was more important to him than frontierism with all these risks of chaos. And it's not humanitarian in its nature, but it is a sign that the most extreme elements that still have America's ear and clearly, you know, have measures of influence might be up against something. going forward, maybe.
All right. Well, at this point, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I would like to show you guys some real history from Simple History. Life under the most evil communist regime, Khmer Rouge. Now, I haven't watched this. This is going to be my first interaction with this material. And I'm going to let it run for a little bit, especially the intro without pausing because I have to pee. So you won't be able to pause it. But as soon as I come back, we'll be able to discuss our thoughts on this, especially because I feel like this will be a good rudder to steer this conversation to the Blowback Podcast and its latest series. All right, let's start.
Life under the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot, famine, and S-21, 1975 to 1979. When the Vietnamese army captured Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia, from the Khmer Rouge in 1979, they found the city in a terrible state, and among the horrors they came across was a former high school that had been turned into a prison and was known as Security Prison 21, or just S-21. The dark buildings were enclosed in electrified barbed wire, and iron bars covered all the windows. The prisoners included academics, doctors, monks, students, and their teachers, as well as factory workers and engineers. All were accused of being enemies of the regime and tortured and forced to name their friends and family members as co-conspirators. Whole families were often brought in together to be interrogated and executed. Ultimately, paranoia meant that the regime began to turn on itself, and the cells were soon filled with party activists and their families, and even high-ranking politicians. At least 18,145 people had been imprisoned there, and all but a handful had been executed. S-21 was only one of more than 150 torture and execution centers established by the Khmer Rouge. Today, it stands as a memorial to the lives lost and to the brutality that they inflicted upon the people of Cambodia.
I don't know, man. I'm not
The Khmer Rouge was the name given to the members of the Communist Party of Cambodia.
Okay, it seems like you guys had a lot of thoughts on the animation style.
Well, and now I'm looking at the food and the wine. They have champagne apparently too.
I hate to say it because Ben has done great work for us, Ben Clarkson, but I think we may have a candidate for next season's trailer, whoever made this. This is a little bit of a cut above, I would say, what we've done with that video.
I agree.
Okay.
I hate to say
so you're saying so far so good. No notes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, look, I mean, it's not saying we were kind of talking over it, but it doesn't seem to be saying anything radically inaccurate.
Yeah, it as Brendan pointed out, in fact, uses like a storytelling element that like we do, which is like, describing the scene, like the moment when like Vietnamese soldiers came into like the torture center of the Khmer Rouge, a place called S-21 or Tuol Sleng, in the capital city of Phnom Penh in Cambodia, after the Vietnamese kicked out the Khmer Rouge. And it's true. Everything that they show in this video is all there. It just looks a little, it's
Is this what YouTube history? Is this what YouTube history is, or history YouTube? Like,
is this what we're up against, Hasan? Is this like our competitor?
I don't know. I've actually never even encountered this channel. I don't think. It's just I kind of looked at it and I was like, what's a good like short and sweet video that we can use as like.
I mean, I am it's like I said, the facts aren't bad.
A lot of people in the chat are saying yes, unironically yes, sadly yes.
that this is what YouTube history is like, because like sometimes I'll look for archival clips. YouTube, you'd be surprised how much you can find, of debates or Nixon or Kissinger tapes, and it's just easy to get from there. But I'll have to scroll by a lot of stuff, and it's the thumbnail of like of a white guy being like this, like looking shocked, and then he's got like a like a pastel background, and it says like, worst war crimes of all time ? And it doesn't. Me off. I was about to say, if anyone knows the Rob Wiseman tweet, Uber driver sucked me off. It kind of just has a very jarring thumbnailification of like quite heavy events. But I guess you could say the same thing about some episodes of our show. So I should probably just be humble.
Well, that's why we were saying that we should have this guy start doing our animation from now on.
In terms of like the content, I was peeing, so I didn't hear it. But did they mention American support for Khmer Rouge early on?
Oh, not yet,
as a
not yet. We're
destabilizing
not. We're at the
We have
beginning
not-
of the story.
We have not gotten there in the video. I wonder if they would, but it's funny. There were people in Cambodia we spoke to. Noah and I went to Cambodia and Vietnam for the purposes of this season, and we had people who were really helpful and showing us around, and even some people there didn't know about America's support for the Khmer Rouge. It's not that it's top secret. It was published by the journalists really on top of these stories at the time, but it seems like a much more important fact than it was ever really given credit for, and that's part of the reason we were attracted to this season, was to not only cover the American bombing of Cambodia and Nixon and Kissinger and the story that is somewhat familiar to people, certainly the Vietnam War is, but to stay after the Vietnam War is over and then see where things went from there. Not only the rise of the Khmer Rouge, but then their weaponization by the United States against our old enemy Vietnam. And I think that people would be quite surprised to learn that, say, when the Vietnamese kicked out Pol Pot, we condemned them kicking out Pol Pot and enforced a sanctions regime against the new government in Phnom Penh during famine conditions. Things that might sound familiar to people from the topic we were just discussing moments ago. So it's a fascinating history, and one that I think, as we try to do, one that we think should be more well known.
All right. Well, let's continue with this this work of art.
CPK, who ruled Cambodia between 1975 and 1979. They were led by the infamous Pol Pot, who attempted to purify Cambodian society along racial, social, and political lines. This led to one of the worst cases of genocide in history. Influenced by Chairman Mao's Great Leap Forward in China, Pol Pot imagined his own super Great Leap Forward in Cambodia. After seizing power in a civil war in 1970,
You made a face there.
Well, I'm intrigued by the thought bubbles that Pol Pot is having. One was just a building, and which they did have.
Also, like, where is he? He looks like he's in a room in a Counter-Strike map.
And then they wanted. It seems like he's dreaming of missiles. I guess I don't.
Yeah,
that
like
really
a super
actually
great
wasn't-
leap forward with missiles. They're leaping forward with missiles.
Yeah,
Just like Mao.
I'm learning. Just like Mao, I'm learning is what I'm saying.
75, the CPK wanted to rapidly build the country under their own vision. Pol Pot compared the Cambodian revolution with those in China, Korea, and Vietnam, and proclaimed that no revolution would be as fast as his. Indeed, the CPK was obsessed with speed, and many in the party were paranoid that they would be replaced, and believed the faster their plans could be achieved, the safer they would be. The super great leap was to be achieved independent of any foreign aid, through independent self-mastery.
Guy sounds like
Khmer
Solid
Rouge
Snake.
theorists
What'd you say?
This guy sounds like Solid Snake to me.
Yeah, a little
Narrator.
bit. Well, I mean, put some respect on David Hayter's name, sir.
Well, I mean, we don't know that it's not him working on this documentary.
He would never do such a thing.
believe that
No,
an
I agree
initial
with you. I'm
period of
just hearing him. I'm
self-imposed
hearing this.
economic isolation would stimulate the rebirth of the crafts and the country's industrial capability. In order to follow this policy of extreme self-reliance, the CPK announced a 4-year plan to triple the country's rice production. However, Cambodia
hear
had
it, Noah?
suffered severely during the Civil War.
I'm
Almost
waiting. I'm
three-quarters
waiting
of-
for him to. I'm waiting for the narrator to say the Khmer Rouge wanted a weapon to rival Metal Gear. Or
Yeah,
something
no,
like
it's
that.
it's
That's pretty
really
good.
like quite intense. It's
you.
like yeah, like I don't know, like brother number snake or something.
Otacon.
revolution. Yeah, revolutionary consciousness, huh?
Pol Pot lined up everyone with glasses and killed them. Otacon, you have glasses.
of the draft animals needed to plow the fields had been killed, and by 1975, rice production had dropped by 84%. Such a rapid increase in production was impossible, but Pol Pot believed this was merely a matter of revolutionary willpower and
I mean, one thing I
instituted
would
his
say is that
policy
like
of
it is worth pointing out, like Pol Pot was the head of this government, but like it was like a clique. Like it was kind of famously like there was a gang that was at the top of the Khmer Rouge during this period. Again, Pol Pot was the guy in charge, but most famously, there was a foreign minister, Yang Sari, defense minister, Sun Sen, head of state, like the president, a guy named Q Sampan, and like they kind of collectively, this is also like in Nazi Germany, like Hitler was the concentrated power of authority, but like he also had like a gang at the top that made it possible for like the Nazi, that we're like essentially the executive function in that regime. And I think it's, like here it was, again, like much poorer, much different place than 1930s Germany. But like what you do see is like this group that's like very paranoid, very secretive, that are carrying out this crazy radical, like, silly radical, like agricultural revolution. They're doing it, in this, crazy like this psychotically backbiting, incompetent way. And so that's like the only thing that I feel like is missing in describing this is that like as one person we interviewed, the journalist Elizabeth Becker, who reported from Cambodia in these years, she said, not during the Khmer Rouge, but before and after, she said that like you have to remember that everything the Khmer Rouge did, just like imagine it's being done, but it's being done like really incompetently by like the most incompetent people in ways that you could not overrate or overstate.
Also, she was there during the Khmer Rouge years. She interviewed Pol Pot.
That's true. She did visit. I just don't want to give the impression that she was like watching all this stuff happening and taking notes. But yes, she had a pretty famous and ill-omened visit.
Maybe Elizabeth is in this video.
What if the Nixon attitude towards Khmer Rouge early on was not about disrupting their Vietnamese neighbors' operations, but instead because Nixon was a secret Maoist?
Have you
guys talked about that?
This is what many of his right-wing critics thought. I mean, Nixon. It's interesting because Nixon came up as a part of the China lobby, kind of political club, which were the fanatics about getting rid of the Chinese revolution. But in partnering with Kissinger and making peace with communist China, as we discussed around the same time that we were actually signing on with Israel as a special relationship. Nixon was betraying, in a large sense, the Cold Warriors that he had come up with, and a lot of people thought he was, a communist somehow. So it has been floated, like John Birch Society types thought that.
Just saying, maybe that's something to investigate a little bit further. He is responsible for giving up the true China, which is
Taiwan.
Yeah, which is Taiwan. So, just saying.
Of agricultural offenses, including a nationwide system of forced labor. He believed that achieving his economic goals would be as simple as winning the Civil War. The army and the CPK's agricultural warfare were the people, and manual labor was the key to victory. The purpose of every Cambodian was to work and advance the revolution. Villages were reorganized into cooperatives, and thousands of city dwellers were forced out of their homes to work on the farms. As a result of this policy, workers of all ages were forced to do 10 to 14 hours of hard labor per day in unsustainable conditions. Often, survivors reported working late into the night, particularly during harvest time, surrounded by encouraging slogans urging them to pledge to sacrifice your life to accomplish Angar's work, or to stay on the work site until death. A lot of food was needed to feed all these productive farmers. However, rice was also needed for Pol Pot's economic goals, so large amounts of rice were extracted from the population for party use and export. The CPK provided nothing in return. Fareth, one survivor of the period, recalled that she was assigned to a children's work unit when she was 11 years old. Fareth was ordered to carry soil, dig trenches, and help build a local dam. She and her unit lived at the work site.
I'm getting the sense this video, like, there was just an interview there with a cartoon person. Like, that must be an interview based on reality, I assume, but they're not like sourcing anything. So I'm just worried this channel may not have the right approach towards sourcing and would undermine its academic viability.
Well, if you've already paid a guy on Fiverr You might as well use them throughout the entire thing. It's an aesthetic choice that they're making, it seems.
It's true.
But one that is probably beneficial um for their profit structure as well.
I didn't know David Hayter was on Fiverr, but they spent the
It's-
money
yeah.
well.
So, let me ask you this question. I guess it's like a broader snapshot of this video that we're watching. Do you feel like covering this perspective exclusively on how this was communism and it was bad communism, evil, scary, gives full attention to actually the rise and fall of the Khmer Rouge?
I think that like one of the things that sort of it really just depends on how much weight somebody tries to put on the communist dimension of this. Like, is this a really communist or Marxist vision? One source that we cite in the show actually talks about plans for agricultural reform that had been drawn up for Thailand, the country next door, that were not all that dissimilar. There were real problems that Cambodia faced with a lot of people living in the city, living in Phnom Penh in particular. And there was some like rebalancing in order. Obviously, the way that the Khmer Rouge went about it was stupid and insane and violent. But I think that it's sort of like the Khmer Rouge didn't do all this because they had like a really I think like really like a rich communist tradition they felt participating in. I think that their vision was actually much more nationalist in nature and was much more focused on a revitalization and renewal of the ancient Khmer kingdom. And that was the sort of axis through which like a lot of like a project of national renovation was really how they kind of characterized a lot of this. They didn't even publicly announce themselves as Marxist until a couple of years into the existence of the regime, and it was only after Mao died, and there was a lot of pressure from China presumably to make that happen.
It was China. There was a communist movement before the Khmer Rouge that was largely dismantled after the 50s, or in the middle of the 50s. They were the sort of second generation of Cambodian communists, and they harbored a lot of bitterness and resentment toward the Vietnamese, which had already existed in some kind of cultural and historical sense in Cambodia. But they really thought the Vietnamese were the final boss, and that everyone in the way, including the American imperialists, were going to do the easy part. And the fact that they did survive the Cambodian Civil War and the American bombing, in which the Viet Cong did the vast majority of the fighting, by the way, for them, only strengthened that idea. By the time they take power, they've been in a socialist movement, but it's been one informed by a kind of small, inward-looking movement that had much more to say about Cambodian nationalism, or believed far more deeply in Cambodian nationalism and therefore the xenophobia they had built up than they did on any kind of doctrinaire socialist project. And they were criticized pretty ruthlessly by their Vietnamese and Chinese friends. Eventually, the Vietnamese weren't their friends, and even when the Chinese were their patron, the Chinese stopped trying to argue with them about the extremism of their program because they were useful enough to them. The Khmer Rouge were useful enough to Beijing as a geopolitical ally, but they really didn't think much of the Khmer Rouge program. So the communist world and the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, had nothing to do with the Khmer Rouge, and in fact tried to unseat them while the U.S. was making common cause with them. So as a communist movement, it was really quite a black sheep in the 20th century. And whether you even care about these labels of what kind of communists they were and blah, blah, blah. I mean, there's a lot of writing on that. Some suggest it was more of a classic peasant revolution that had far less to do with modern ideas of socialism and communism. But they certainly at first identified as such. When they go into the jungles in the 80s, after the Vietnamese kicked them out and the Americans start supporting them, though, they were the first communist party to dissolve themselves. And Pol Pot said, we're going to have to follow the West now. And they got rid of their Mao jackets and they started wearing safari suits. And so they gave up the communist look pretty quickly, which of course makes some suspect that they ever
And
really.
they also, I don't think, were ever like, they didn't have like, they didn't have like a rich set of relations with other third world nations. They were very isolated. They were, like a lot of communist states have meaningful foreign relations, and in the case of the Khmer Rouge, they had one set of relations with China, which sent them a bunch of money, and that was who they cared about. And for a time, at the beginning, they had relations with Vietnam before that went south. And yeah, I mean, to me, like,
Seems like you're
sort of
saying
just
they're MAGA
reiterate.
communists.
Yeah,
That's what
I
someone
mean,
said in the Majority Report comment section the other day, which in a way, well, they were make Cambodia great again, communists.
Yeah,
But
MACA.
yes, in a sense they were.
Yeah, or
MACA, yeah.
yeah,
Makaga.
I could use some Mac.
Makaga.
But
Love
yeah,
Macas.
they gave up their communism pretty quickly as soon as it became advantageous to. So I guess that if people want to judge them on how they acted once they were out of power, it doesn't seem too sincere. They let the Yugoslavs in to film a documentary at one point, but otherwise Noah's right. Their only real relationship in the trading and economic sense was with China, and the U.S. We funneled them money and arms and training through a coalition, which is always useful to do, kind of like the Mujahideen, and just claimed that if anything gets to the Khmer Rouge, we had no idea. Of course, most of it did. Peter Jennings did a great documentary piece for ABC in the early 90s, and we were still supporting them, and basically told the world that we were. It's really good. I think it's still on YouTube. I grabbed a copy elsewhere, but for the show, but it's a good report. And unfortunately, it didn't stop us doing it.
One thing that you brought up was the way that the media was talking about the Khmer Rouge early on during the period of our, not so overt allegiance. And I think that is very instructive, usually, in figuring out like where the State Department's opinions lie. I believe you said that there was like positive coverage as well, not dissimilar to Osama bin Laden from Western media.
In the beginning, the most positive coverage of the Khmer Rouge were coming from left-wing sympathizers who thought that there was no way that these stories from refugees going into Thailand could possibly be true. There was a history, a very real
Noam
history.
Chomsky, the Noam Chomsky paradigm as well. Isn't that like something that
he got in trouble for saying that we have to be suspect about the stories? I think it's been a little exaggerated to the degree that it's not as though he said they're all lies, but he was operating off of the, again, very real history that we also cover in the show of pure invention of communist atrocity when it came to Vietnam. So I think there were a lot of left wingers who were like, I'm not going to get fooled again, and in so doing, did not see it.
The Vietnamese themselves, like, bottled, like, they were, about 2 years into the reign of the Khmer Rouge, when things, I mean, really after the first year, when things started to go quite badly, the sort of, like, one way that they began resolving their problems without really resolving them was by attacking Vietnam, which China was happy for, because they wanted Vietnam, they viewed Vietnam as their principal rival, and they were like, well, Cambodia is kind of a basket case, but if they're going to, take the fight to Vietnam, then fuck it, good for them. And I think that, like, in Vietnam, we cite sources, people who ended up after a border conflict, where Cambodian forces, Khmer Rouge forces, massacre Vietnamese villages. And, these are people from, Soviet bloc countries, not necessarily that sympathetic to Cambodia in this stage, more sympathetic to Vietnam. And they are just learning, after, like 2 years into this, they're like, oh, only now am I did I start to consider that, like, the Cambodian Holocaust stories were real, that's what this Hungarian journalist called them. But I think that that's sort of a good illustration of also how, like, the earliest coverage of these people really emphasized, like, the mystery and secretiveness of this, because again, like, that's part of what happens when you don't have foreign relations, is that, like, the only people who end up supporting your doofy radical program are academics who don't know better and don't have firsthand knowledge, and I guess China in this case.
the more striking stuff is the coverage of them, the positive coverage of them long after these were reported. And we cite one New York Times op-ed whose title was Pol Pot, brutal, yes, but no mass murderer. And the pull quote in that is, Vietnam is the real threat to Cambodia. This was because, and actually that journalist was a very involved journalist in covering the brutal wars America was waging in Indochina. And he had just preserved a certain, I suppose you would say, misguided allegiance to the Khmer Rouge, to the point where he opposed the Vietnamese into the 90s for, I guess, being mean to them and overthrowing Pol Pot. At any rate, it was in the New York Times. It was good enough for them. And of course, there were sort of feigned protests by American diplomats, but we preserved their seat at the UN and allowed for good coverage of them and positive coverage of them. So that's perhaps more shocking to people. And of course, the actual U.S. policy itself is shocking. But they when Elizabeth Becker, one of the key guests in our show, she was with one of these Western academics. He's all Scottish, I think, or Australian.
Yeah, he was a Scottish academic who worked at SOAS in London. Malcolm McDowell.
And he got murdered a room over from her while they were visiting, and they were interviewing Pol Pot, and she almost got attacked herself, but she escaped. And he was killed. She suspects that the Cambodians did it to kind of say never come back, even though they were the ones who had invited her and the deceased guy. So yeah, it was an odd ideological trajectory from all sides, as the sort of the super third worldists and the American architects of foreign policy came together in saying these guys aren't so bad because the Vietnamese are the real imperialists at this point.
And
Very,
that
very
was
bizarre.
like the narrative of Vietnam as committing wanton massacres. I mean, there were the issues over boat people, Chinese ethnic minorities in Vietnam and their treatment. Vietnam was catching a lot of black eyes in the sort of global PR of the time, but they were absorbing all that while they were people were criticizing them for being the military power and control of Cambodia throughout the 1980s. But they always, sort of leave out that, the reason Vietnam was still there was because the Khmer Rouge were running that insurgency. So there is this also this process where it's they valorize the Khmer, or sorry, not valorize, but they, there was this toleration of the Khmer Rouge, and instead of talking about their crimes or even talking about the Vietnamese tribunal for Khmer Rouge crimes, not even wanting to engage with the Vietnamese presence at all, we immediately thought well, how can we use Pol Pot against them, because they must be so de facto they are Hitler, not us, not Pol Pot. It's the Vietnamese.
And the Vietnamese had their citizens massacred by the thousands right on their border. This wasn't us going to Iraq and starting a 10-year occupation for no reason, or even the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which we covered last year, which again was right on their border. The Khmer Rouge were hoping to start a war with Vietnam, and they did. And Vietnam simply said, all right, we're nipping this in the bud. We know all the fucked up stuff these people have done, and it's not coming to us. And that is why they took the action that they did. They probably weren't so interested in an invasion, given they had to reconstruct their country, which wasn't an easy thing to do. We cover that as kind of like a side story in the show, because the U.S. promised Vietnam war reparations under Nixon. And once he was ousted, we said, Nixon who? And denied them their reparations.
I mean, it looks
so Vietnam had a lot of. Mm-hmm.
Oh no, I was just saying, because Hasan was scrolling this video, and it looks like this video is just kind of about how much life sucked under the Khmer Rouge.
Yeah.
There's a
Fair
section
enough.
on children and child labor. Then there's one on executions and one on prison. I mean, it makes sense. It's interesting in that the Khmer Rouge did have an interrogation and executions policy. I don't know to what extent this video gets super deep into that, but all of their torture centers, it was, the whole program was called S21, and the idea about it, This is like the expression. And by the way, this guy Richard Dudman, he was a reporter at the St. Louis Dispatch for many years in the 20th century. He was an American reporter who had witnessed firsthand. He had been one of the very few reporters who, in the early 1970s, was in Cambodia and was with Vietnamese troops, Viet Cong soldiers, as they hid from American bombs being dropped on Cambodia. So, like, to give you a sense of how powerful the anti-Vietnam dogma was, a guy who saw the Americans bomb Cambodia firsthand and whose life was in danger because of it is the guy who wrote this Pol Pot article, because that's how strong, that's how much we can make them into bad guys.
This is another thread of this season is the Sino-Soviet split, which is really representative of the greater split among, the left all across the world, including the most annoying contingent of the left, the Western left. And the Western left had a bunch of crack-ups about, are you a Maoist? Are you a third worldist? Are you supporting Pol Pot and the Maoist movements, the real movements? Or are you a fucking revisionist social fascist who supports the USSR? And the USSR wrote off a lot of the Chinese allies and the Chinese themselves as wackos. It's a very interesting conflict. But yeah, Dudman, I don't know if he was like ideologically on that level, but sort of as a reporter, yeah, he, as I said earlier, he was one of these guys who allowed his sympathy in the 60s for the Khmer Rouge fighters to turn him against the other fighters against the American war, the Vietnamese. And so it was like this strange, like, sort of siphoning off of support until people would arrive at only the Khmer Rouge, people of a certain opinion, which is a strange place to end up. But you can kind of see how it happens. I don't know. Strange times.
Damn. So would you say that this period of American foreign policy is like uniquely schizophrenic, or like is it the Madman
actually, in a
theory,
lot
or
of
is
ways it makes a lot of sense. Like, that's part of what's so jarring and horrible about it, is that like essentially part of what the Cambodia, there's a book that we cite a lot in our show for this season called Sideshow, by the journalist William Shawcross. And although he later on moved,
who also had an ideological journey.
Yeah, he's you can look him up. He's a British journalist. He's right wing now. But this original book, Sideshow, like, it was called Sideshow because the idea was that the Cambodia was a sideshow to the Vietnam War. But I think what our season has sort of recovered is not so much that, like, yes, the Vietnam conflict, yes, we bombed Cambodia, and that was because we tried to widen the Vietnam War in an effort to end it. We were like, all right, well, Nixon said, I'd rather not just withdraw from Vietnam. I'd like to withdraw from Vietnam, but I want to increase the pressure, and I want to bomb where I think the Vietnamese are in Cambodia. And eventually that's, that was pushing the sets of dominoes that lead to the rise of the Khmer Rouge, sparking the civil war in that country and all that. But the other thing that Cambodia is not just the sideshow to the Vietnam War, but it was this part of this, larger drama by which the U.S. was like rearranging what its Cold War strategy was for what became the final phase of the Cold War against the Soviet Union. The Khmer Rouge and the support for the Khmer Rouge was an early joint venture with China. You could look at it that way. Yep. You could see the sort of, the cynicism in our policy as having actually like a really kind of dramatic coherence to it. I think what's schizophrenic is just how what feels schizophrenic and so immoral is that there was no reason that Henry Kissinger had to bomb Cambodia and also make detente with the Soviet Union. Why couldn't we just have detente? What was the fucking purpose of setting this country on fire, ultimately to arrive at the same thing in 1975 that would have fucking happened anyway years earlier with the end of Saigon, the fall of Saigon?
To ventriloquize the Kissinger Nixon logic a little bit, I think they viewed the world in the grand chessboard, spheres of influence, 19th century Bismarckian way. And that's certainly how Kissinger wrote and thought. And that's how Nixon, maybe not at the beginning of his career, but by the time he was the president, that's how he thought. He was considered himself a foreign policy president and one in the mold of creating a stable world order in which America is first among equals. When you take that view, prestige matters a lot. And so I think that, not to actually disagree with Noah about the human cost of any of this, but to their minds, if they were going to embark on as risky and bold a venture as making peace with China and normalizing relations with China to basically drive a wedge in the communist world, or take advantage of a wedge that was already forming in the communist world, they couldn't also lose the Vietnam War and also the war in Cambodia. They had to be strong enough by winning or perpetuating that war and punishing our victims there, to be strong enough and have this credibility of strength to make this other bold move, and vice versa. So it became a feedback loop of this kind of horrible logic where big countries we can work with, like China or the Soviet Union, because they got the SALT treaty out of it with the Soviet Union, which was good. But it's always at the expense of the smaller nations. This was something that Fidel kind of said around the time of the missile crisis, which you can agree with and disagree with as well in certain ways, which was like, although overall I find it persuasive, which is the United States and the USSR, we know they're going to work stuff out. The question is, what happens to us, the small countries? And I think that was the same question hanging over.
Hot war in all these little countries. Or you had like
even some not so little ones like Indonesia.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Indonesia or fucking Bangladesh and Pakistan. I mean, those are not small countries either. It's rather, it's rather, there's some rather savage wars of peace. You could argue.
Yeah, and it's not to defend or revise the idea in America, and certainly in the countries where this happened, that Kissinger and Nixon were involved in evil ventures or brutal, senseless violence. But I think it's worth clinically and, carefully looking at why their policy was what it was, and what stabilizing things did come out of it, and what destabilizing things and terrible things came out of it. It was good to make peace with communist China. That was a needlessly hostile and destructive American policy for decades. It wasn't a good thing to obviously base that kind of progress on the expense of hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people in Indochina. Anthony Blinken possesses all of the craven aspects, for example, of what Kissinger would allow or enforce for his president on the global stage, with obviously zero of the vision or pretenses to vision that you can at least recognize in a self-aggrandizing, but ultimately significant historical statesman like Kissinger. Blinken is just a hopeless fool, and the American foreign policy now doesn't have anything like the kind of gutsy vision that these imperial minds had in the middle of the Cold War. So that's a way of talking about schizophrenia, the different angles. Like the last thing I'll say about it, to sum it up, is in China, when Kissinger died, he is officially a celebrated figure.
Yeah.
Americans, there's memes and he was evil. He's the most evil guy, which I sometimes think is kind of lets every other American war criminal off the hook. If it's just like, oh, there's just one guy who was just the one evil person. It's not to defend or be an apologist. I think it's a little bit of baby's first,
Well, he is the reason that the Kissinger hate is so passionate is because of a very specific thing, which is that he lied about the Vietnam War ending, and like the sense of antipathy that I think like generations of Americans have held for him for years in particular really just comes down to like that more than anything, that he was like Nixon's Vietnam butt boy, and like that the justifiable and totally correct hatred of him at front.
He got a Nobel Peace Prize.
Exactly. Like it makes a lot, it's he was sort of,
So did Obama.
I mean, I was gonna say he reminds me honestly of like Elon Musk. Like, just imagine having to see his fucking mug everywhere for the 70s. Like, my God, that would be annoying.
Yeah.
Although it must be said, Kissinger was a much more. He had far more game than Elon Musk. He had far more riz than Elon
Yeah.
Musk.
Yeah,
Which
I
is
mean,
not
he
a
did
high
a lot.
bar.
He did a lot with how ugly he was. So I want to ask you guys one final question, but like, in terms of like, I guess on its face, somewhat incomprehensible foreign policy movements that the Nixon Kissinger duo engaged in. Do you see an analog there with the current administration and the way that they're dealing with the dynamics between Hezbollah, Iran, the Gulf states, and also Israel? Or is it more so just like you said on autopilot at this point, and it's just like Anthony Blinken is a wormish figure who is just trying to let everybody dominate him. He's just sitting in the cuck seat, along for the journey.
I agree with that. The one thing I would add is say that, like, maybe the way to look at it is not like, oh, is this situation like that one or something, but it's like, what are the dynamics that were present in that situation and that may be present in this one and vice versa? Like, in this case, like in Lebanon and Cambodia are not like an exact parallel. They're not, like, and you can't force them. But there is a truth to the fact that like Cambodia and Lebanon were both sort of drawn into this, they're sort of in a conflict with Israel that is connected to a conflict that is connected to this other frontier of the conflict. And now Israel, as the war-making party in the way that the U.S. was, now has to like spread the war around because it cannot resolve the domestic political issues that would come with actually just ending the war, which in Nixon's case was the paranoia about not losing the war, really, his obsession with that, in addition to the anti-communist fervor or whatever. And in the case of Israel, it's about like, I mean, it's all of the things that we talked about earlier, the ideology, the sense, the actual stakes of survival or financial crisis and so on. But to me, that's sort of the point of comparison, is about like the degree to which like, a war can spread and suck other things in for no good, intelligible reason at all, other than to satisfy, the political prerogatives of the war-making party.
Yeah, we've talked about how there was a vision on behalf that the Nixon and Kissinger were pursuing. China, détente with the USSR, that was far more, honestly, compared to the policy that came before, far more coherent and possibly constructive even. That was taken in tandem with incredibly senseless wars that they viewed as bargaining chips, the countries involved as bargaining chips. I think what you have is no vision in the American side nowadays that could compare to their idea of a new world order that they were building. Israel's an alliance with Israel being one part of that, and it's Israel who is taking just the senseless violence half of the Nixon-Kissinger strategy, which, as Noah just said, you compare Nixon's remark when he announced the invasion of Cambodia. He said, to your point, Hasan, at the top of our part of the show, he said, "This is not an invasion. This is a way to end the war in Vietnam." In other words, escalating things into Cambodia is a way to de-escalate them in Vietnam. Well, what did Israel say the other day? We are escalating things as a way to achieve de-escalation. It's hard not to see an echo of what we discussed this season and the kind of ripple effects that can have on a formerly nearby but neutral third country. And it remains to be seen. I hate when people say this, but we have to see, how Hezbollah, which has been attacked and has the right to self-defense, how conservative they are and how much of a balancing act they are willing to put up. Because Cambodia put up a balancing act for many years to spare itself the violence. And eventually it failed. So we'll have to see how that goes in this case. But no one in our current day is, unfortunately, can be said to be as on the level of Nixon and Kissinger, I think, as far as their grand master plans are concerned.
Yeah, I mean, we're now in a position where like Nixon and Kissinger, part of what made them so special, let's say, or unique, was that Kissinger literally had permission when as soon as he became a national security advisor to like redo the wiring in Washington and become the most powerful advisor, like the hand of the prince or the hand of the king or whatever.
Literally the wiring.
he could do whatever, he had the authority to do all that. And one of the things with Biden world that's sort of become evident is that there's this troika at the top. You have Jake Sullivan, Anthony Blinken, and Bill Burns, who's the head of the CIA. And Bill Burns is the one who clearly is trusted with like the big boy stuff or whatever, but like there isn't actually any, like I don't really believe at this stage that we have any evidence that there is a driver's seat, let alone somebody in it, in terms of like the American strategic outlook here. So to affirm what Brennan was saying, that like there's nobody who's on the Nixon Kissinger level or whatever, because like the situation that we have now is not is not anything like that. It's this inertia. It's this horrible, like it's like a carotid artery that's like, exactly what like, pro-Israel lobby has purchased and won for itself through its machinations. Like that's what it wants, because that is what enables the status quo to persist. It was a different era 50 years ago, just a radically different time.
It's just hard to comprehend when you have to consider that there is like this incredibly powerful force, this blight on human society for so many generations is just like basically falling asleep at the wheel, and like the car is just 3 seconds removed from flying off the side of the cliff. Like it feels insane.
I think autopilot is the right word. I mean, it's not to say like America doesn't know what it's doing or no one's at the wheel, but I think autopilot in terms of the strategic, again, not to overuse the word, but the strategy, the strategic vision, the idea of how America's power is going to sustain itself over the next 100 years. Nixon and Kissinger, they thought they had a plan for that, and wasn't quite 100 years, but they did set down a lot of things in stone that stuck. By now, I think their China policy has been reversed. Obviously, we're in a Cold War with China in many ways. The Israel alliance is still there.
I mean, they left room for that too. It's not like, I mean, strategic ambiguity is obviously like still leaving a lot of
the Soviet Union fell, So in a sense, maybe the China factor was not as important to them. Although in Nixon's waning years, he did say that NATO needs to back off, because what would come after the Soviet Union, should we continue to creep up to them, would be and as he considered it, an even more dangerous form of Russian nationalism. And he said NATO needs to chill out, as did a lot of other Cold Warriors. Kissinger, in his final years, was talking about how America should do business with Belt and Road, not attack it. So very different form of statecraft than it's not to endorse it, but it has very key differences from the sort of, again, lazy and incoherent liberal aggression that you find under, or I should say aggression that you find under a liberal government like Biden, with the so-called, liberal brain trust like Sullivan and Mr. Blues man, what's his name? Anthony Blinken.
Oh, Blinken.
Like that's.
No, I mean that does make sense though, with what you said about Nixon and what you said about Kissinger tracks with like their realpolitik attitude in terms of like understanding the changes that are happening broadly around the globe and like responding to them in a very cold and calculated manner that is beneficial for America. Whereas nowadays I feel like in the post 9/11 universe, we have a significantly more like liberal savior attitude. Like we have seemingly deluded ourselves into thinking that like, no, we are the world police and that is a good thing. And it's not necessarily something that you just tell the American population so that you can justify whatever imperialist endeavor you engage in.
Well, and just one last thing on that. It's like you hear it all the time, but I heard it yet again the other day where Biden said, America will not retreat from the world. And that's the type of that's the line they've gone with. And it's like, all right, well, then don't retreat from withholding Israel's aid and weapons and money. You're retreating from the world in a very significant sense when you don't use the leverage you have over a client state committing extermination campaign and just let them do it. That sounds like a retreat to me, but that's of course not what the actual line is meant to convey. What they mean is that it makes it sound like it's a bold and active approach towards solving problems, when in fact it's trying to say we won't retreat. We won't retreat from the world, meaning we won't retreat from a failed imperial autopilot that has really no ideas left. We're just going to stick with it. Because if you really wanted to not retreat, you might be more active in solving this conflict. I hate the word conflict in regards to Palestine, but certainly the ability to yank Israel's ability to wage war away from it, that would be pretty proactive. But no one seems to want to do it.
And beneficial for future American moral posturing.
It would be. It unambiguously would be.
And electorally beneficial. Like, so.
If they came out and said people would see through it. Probably people on this call and watching it would see through it. But they could come out and say, we did it. We got the ceasefire. We yanked their weapons away. And guess what? American power, baby. We got.
And by the way, guess who's gone? That bad man Netanyahu. Oh, what? He was popular in Israel at the time that we decapitated him. Don't fucking care. We're America. No, they're not like.
We're humiliated.
I mean, this is where like one of the ways out.
Liberal Zionism was always the exit ramp that I thought they would take far before this moment. And when Benny Gantz came to America to talk to Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, I was like, oh, this is what they're going to do. They're going to get the fucking liberal general to be like the new leader. And now that method has been a demonstrable failure because you got fucking Benny Gantz like outside of the governing coalition now. And Benjamin Netanyahu's popularity has only increased. And you even have the likes of Yair Lapid, the supposed centrist opposition to Benjamin Netanyahu, like chirping like a seal in celebration of blowing up Lebanese pagers and the prospect of invading Lebanon. It's insane.
Yep. Yeah. I think it's hit it on the head earlier that it's certainly key that Israel's internal politics do not allow for anyone that America wants to work with to come to any kind of reasonable conclusion at this point. It's turtles all the way down there with the maniac mentality. But that would simply mean that those in the White House and the State Department and elsewhere could, as we said just a moment ago, say we're America, baby, and we're not going to let anyone tell us what to do, whether they're an ally or not. We're gonna force them and bring them to a heel. But that's actually far too bold and far too gutsy for them to try. So they're just going to, let it all happen, which is politically makes them look weak, and more importantly, allows a horrible slaughter to continue. Obviously.
Yeah, it's all good. American soldiers will go and die in battle in Lebanon if Israel chooses to do so. And then that will be so politically disadvantageous to the Democratic Party's position of failing to stop this dead in its tracks that Donald Trump will become president. And then Donald Trump will be seen as the bold, brave savior of American foreign policy by quickly putting together at least like a fake deal that makes Netanyahu seem like he's actually backed away. And then he'll allow Benjamin Netanyahu to annex the West Bank.
Yep.
Great stuff overall.
Possible.
Awesome. Great job, Joe.
Anyway, thanks so much, guys, for coming on. Where can people find your podcast?
They can find our podcast at blowback.show.
Blowback.show. Press the big button that says subscribe. Our season, you'll get it all at once, not just the 10 main episodes where we talk you through this story, but also bonus episodes. We do interviews with Cy Hirsch. We do interviews with some of the journalists we mentioned on this call, Elizabeth Becker. As we said, we went to Cambodia and Vietnam this season. So we sprinkle in a lot of moments where we're talking to people who live there, who live through this stuff. And we have obviously those interviews are translated. And we're pretty proud of it, and we hope everyone goes and signs up and enjoys it.
Oh, before you guys leave, I have an extra question. Noah, specifically for you, you hang out with Cy. Have you ever asked him about a particular Benjamin Netai that he may or may not have gotten classified intel from when writing an article for the New York Times back in the day?
Yeah, I mean, he told me that story. It's a great story about how basically, and this is in his Substack, which I encourage people to subscribe to, but he talks about how it was common knowledge that when Benjamin Netanyahu was deputy ambassador at the UN, deputy ambassador in DC and then ambassador at the UN, he was a go-to guy to get intel. And
not necessarily Israeli intel, right? American
Correct.
intel.
It was Israeli intel or American, but the idea was that Netanyahu would share intel and would schmooze with the press very openly and aggressively. No, he's got he's got many stories like that over many, many years. And I was lucky enough to hear that one right before he published it. So hopefully, some of the other goofy ones he's told me will be coming out in his Substack sometime soon. But yeah, we talked to him this season as well, and he was it's the only episode that we've ever done that is just totally unedited. Like, it is just the phone call with me, Brendan, and Sai, and it's really, really fun. It's really good.
Hell yeah. That's Blowback Podcast. Everybody, thank you so much, Brendan James, Noah Kulwin. We're coming on. Love to have you guys, as always.
Hasan.
Thank you, Hasan. Take it easy.
Bye. That was Brendan James and Noah Kulwin, ladies and gentlemen, of the Blowback Podcast. Fantastic podcast. I highly recommend you guys check it out. It will help you understand American foreign policy. I know in a lot of instances I talk about how America is bad, or I say America bad, but this is exactly how America bad and why I say America bad. Anyway.